Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. My wedding dress pooled around me like spilled milk, white, flawless, and entirely meaningless. I was the replacement, a desperate transaction executed in the shadows to cover a catastrophic flight. Choices vanished quickly when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. Julian had accumulated enough financial ruin to drown our family twice over, a mountain of reckless wagers and failed corporate bids. Creditors were not banks with patient grace periods. They were corporate scavengers led by Victor Vance, a man who viewed human lives solely through the lens of leverage and liquidation. When my twin sister vanished on the morning of her wedding, leaving nothing behind but a drafty open window and a discarded lace veil, Julian did not mourn her absence. He panicked. The collateral for his massive debt was supposed to be this marriage. Without the bride, Victor would seize the ancestral house, the remaining assets, and everything we had left our names. So, my father shoved me into the empty space she left behind. I did not resent my sister for running. Elena was a bird meant for open skies, entirely unsuited for the golden cage Julian had constructed. She could not breathe under his thumb, and she certainly could not survive a loveless contract with a reclusive billionaire. I understood why she climbed out that window. I stayed because someone had to absorb the impact. Someone had to stand between our father's reckless wagers and the ruthless debt collection that would follow. I had spent my entire life making myself small, blending into the background, letting my art be my only voice. Stepping into the blinding spotlight of this transaction felt like stepping onto an executioner's block. The dress was a masterpiece of French silk and suffocating expectations. It took 3 maids to lace the back, pulling the ribbons so tight they bruised my ribs. I remembered standing in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, staring at a stranger. The white silk fell heavily around my feet. It was a beautiful garment, but to me, it felt like a cold, restrictive shroud. The church had been a blur of cold marble, echoing vows, and the oppressive sweet scent of dying lilies. I had kept my head bowed at the altar. I had let the thick veil conceal my face, terrified that the ruthless corporate tycoon standing beside me would look closely enough to see the truth. I was not the bride he wanted. I was not the restless, radiant, free-spirited woman he had purchased to merge 2 fading empires. I was Clara, the quiet sister, the artist who lived in the shadows, nursing bruised hands and charcoal-stained fingertips. Now trapped in the back of the moving limousine, the silence between us was suffocating. The heavy, rhythmic drumming of the coastal rain against the tinted glass was the only sound in the world. Outside, the towering pines of the Pacific Northwest whipped violently in the storm, blurring into dark, aggressive streaks of green and slate gray. The world felt entirely unmoored, washing away the sterile safety of the cathedral we had just left. I sat rigidly against the chill of the leather seat. The air inside the cabin was thick, heavy, with the expectation of an incoming storm. Arthur sat beside me, a silhouette of dark-tailored wool and winter stone. I knew about his reputation. Arthur Pendleton was a phantom in the financial world. Reclusive, stoic, and devastatingly efficient, he was a man who dismantled corporate legacies without raising his voice. He was supposed to be a monster, a man who devoured failing companies and bought marriages to secure his dynasty's public image. I waited for the explosion. I waited for him to demand why the woman sitting next to him did not have a faint scar on her left collarbone, why her hands were calloused from handling oil paints instead of soft from expensive manicures. Every mile that passed was a tightening in my chest. My hands rested in my lap, trembling so violently that the heavy diamond necklace around my throat felt like a tightening collar. The corset of the gown dug into my ribs, restricting my breathing to shallow, panicked gasps. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing myself for the inevitable moment when the car would pull over, when the deception would be dragged into the cruel light, when the wrath of the Pendleton Empire would finally crash down upon my head. Then, the shadows shifted. I flinched, pulling myself instinctively closer to the locked door. I expected a harsh grip, a sharp demand, a furious interrogation. Instead, there was only the soft rustle of heavy fabric. A sudden, unexpected envelopment of warmth draped over my freezing bare shoulders. I opened my eyes, Arthur had removed his heavy wool coat. He did not toss it at me. He placed it over my shivering frame with a slow, deliberate care, as if adjusting a fragile frame around a canvas. The scent of cedarwood and faint rain immediately wrapped around me, grounding the chaotic spiral of my panic. The wool was rough against my skin, but it was incredibly, overwhelmingly warm. It carried the lingering heat of his body, a physical weight that pressed down the rising tide of my anxiety. He did not look at me. He did not demand gratitude. He simply turned his gaze back to the rain-streaked window, watching the landscape blur into the coming night. I stared at his profile, completely unmoored. Not because he was cruel, but because his silence demanded nothing. My shaking fingers crept upward, involuntarily gripping the heavy lapel of the coats to steady my hands. The fabric was a tether in a world that felt entirely unstable. I held onto it like a lifeline in the dark. He had to know something was wrong. A man who noticed the slightest shift in global markets would not miss the frantic terror radiating off the woman sitting inches away from him. And yet the only thing he offered was a quiet shield against the cold. The Pendleton estate rose from the coastal cliffs like a fortress of old money and locked secrets. The limousine slowed to a halt beneath a towering stone portico, the tires hissing against the wet gravel. The heavy oak doors were hauled open by silent staff, revealing a cavernous entrance hall, lined with cold gray marble and sterile, perfectly polished surfaces. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum where nothing living, nothing messy or human, was allowed to remain. I pulled the heavy outer garment tighter around my shoulders as I stepped into the echoing silence, my silk heels clicking sharply against the stone. The air inside was climate-controlled, entirely devoid of the scent of rain or damp earth. An hour later, I found myself sitting at one end of a massive mahogany dining table. The space between us stretched like a frozen river, a vast expanse of polished wood that emphasized the immense physical and emotional distance between me and my new husband. Above us, a massive crystal chandelier cast long, sharp shadows across the pristine white linen tablecloth. Dinner had been served with silent, invisible efficiency. Plates of delicate, intricate food were set before us, but the aroma of roasted vegetables and seared meats tasted like ash in my dry mouth. I tried to play the role I had been forced into. I picked up my crystal wineglass, attempting to mimic my sister's light, effortless grace. Elena would have commanded the room. She would have laughed at the storm outside, twirled her silver fork, and charmed the cold billionaire into a state of easy submission. But I was not her. My performance felt clumsy and fraudulent. The delicate stem of the glass felt entirely foreign in my calloused fingers. The silence in the room was crushing, amplifying the faint scrape of silver against porcelain until it sounded like a warning bell. Arthur sat at the opposite end of the table. He was barely touching his meal. His dark eyes were fixed on me, heavy and observant. He was not glaring, but the sheer weight of his attention made it impossible to swallow the food in front of me. The panic that had briefly subsided in the car began to rise rapidly in my throat again, choking my airways. I was going to be exposed. Julian was going to face absolute ruin. The hostile creditors would tear our family apart by morning, seizing the ancestral house and tossing us into the street. The deception was too massive, too clumsy to survive the night. I was a terrible actress, and the man sitting across from me was a master of discerning the truth. I lowered my gaze to my plate, my breath hitching in a quiet, suppressed gasp. I waited for the axe to fall. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the heavy air. I jumped slightly in my high-backed chair. Arthur had picked up his silver spoon. He tapped it gently against the edge of his porcelain soup bowl. A deliberate, singular clink that shattered the oppressive silence and forced me to look up. He rested his hands flat on the polished table. His expression was unreadable, carved the same wintern as stone as the mansion around us. Clara. The name dropped into the room like a heavy stone into still water. Not my sister's name, not a generic term of endearment, mine. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. My heart slammed against my ribs so violently it physically ached. I froze entirely, my fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard. My knuckles turned a bruised, painful white. The charade was over. He knew. He had known all along. I braced myself for the explosion, for the cold fury of a billionaire who realized he had been sold a counterfeit bride. I waited for him to call his security, to order me out into the freezing rain, to pick up the phone and destroy my father with a single, ruthless command. Arthur did not reach for his phone. He did not raise his voice. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension in his broad shoulders loosening just a fraction. "You do not have to hide your tears in this house," he said. His voice was low, carrying a rough, quiet gravity that anchored the spinning room. I stared at him, my vision blurring, completely unable to process the total absence of anger in his tone. He was looking at me not as a defective product, not as a thief who had stolen a massive fortune, but as a terrified woman drowning in a storm she did not create. "I have had the staff prepare the guest wing in the east corridor," he continued softly, his gaze remaining steady on my pale face. "It is entirely yours. No one will enter without your permission. You will find it warm, and you will find it secure." I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg him not to ruin my family, but the words caught in the tight knot of my throat. He was not demanding a wedding night. He was not demanding an explanation for the bait and switch. He was offering me a boundary, a locked door, a quiet sanctuary away from the crushing expectations of the world outside. He stood slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the pristine white linen. He buttoned his suit jacket, nodded once in my direction with a profound, quiet respect, and turned to leave the dining room. He did not demand answers. He did not gloat over my terror. He simply stepped back and allowed me the space to breathe. I sat alone at the massive table, long after his footsteps faded down the marble hall. The warmth of the untouched soup radiated faintly against my numb hands. The steady ticking of a grandfather clock echoed in the empty space, measuring the quiet seconds of my new reality. I closed my eyes. I had fought so hard to suppress, finally slipping down my cheeks in the quiet room. The man I had feared as a ruthless jailer had just handed me the keys to my own cell, and for the first time in my life, I had no idea how to interpret the silence. 2 weeks passed in a profound, unmoored quiet. The terror of my wedding night had slowly dissolved into an isolating, solitary routine. Morning after morning came quietly. No trumpets, no shift in the universe, just the pale beams of light slipping through the tall windows of the East Corridor guest wing, brushing against my shoulder like a second thought. I woke up each day in the center of a massive 4-poster bed, the heavy silk blankets tangled loosely around my legs. The fabric was exquisitely soft, a stark contrast to the coarse, stiff linen I was accustomed to in my father's house. For a long, suspended moment each morning, I simply stared at the high, vaulted ceiling, waiting for the familiar, crushing weight of Julian's expectations to press down on my chest. I waited for the sharp rap at the door, for the frantic demands of the creditors, for the suffocating reality of the debt that had effectively sold me into this transactional existence. But those Eastern guest quarters remained completely, immaculately silent. My days were spent navigating the sprawling Pendleton estate, struggling to adapt to the unforgiving echo of chilly stone floors and the sterile expectations of my new reality. The terror had given way to a deep, heavy confusion. Arthur Pendleton had known my true identity all along. He had looked right through the heavy bridal veil, bypassed my clumsy attempt to mimic my sister's radiant charm, and simply offered me a locked door. There had been no wrath. There had been no cruel demands for his money back, and no immediate threat to toss me out into the violent coastal storm. Instead, Arthur offered only space and distance. But the silence between us was not entirely empty. During that second week, I began to notice the small, unspoken gestures. A fresh, steaming copper tea kettle and a porcelain cup of chamomile tea would appear just outside my door, paused precisely as the evening chill set in, the warmth seeping into my numb hands. The sterile, industrial scent of the main house did not extend into my private rooms. Here, the walls were painted in soft, warm tones of cream and muted gold, and the air carried a faint, soothing trace of lavender and something deeper, something distinctly grounded. It was on the 14th day that I found the final door, at the very end of the hall left slightly ajar. A warm, golden rectangle of natural light spilled out onto the polished floorboards. I wrapped a thick woolen shawl over my shoulders, my bare feet sinking into the thick, woven rug as I approached. I pushed the door open, my breath catching softly in my throat as I stepped over the threshold. It was not another guest bedroom. It was a fully realized, breathtaking art studio. The space was framed by massive, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the rugged coastline and the churning, slate-gray waters of the Pacific Northwest. The morning light poured in without obstruction, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the quiet air. In the exact center of the room stood a magnificent, hand-built cedarwood easel. It was not a generic, flimsy factory-made stand. It was heavy, exceptionally sturdy, crafted from thick, fragrant wood that filled the entire room with its rich, earthy scent. I walked forward slowly, my fingertips grazing the smooth, polished surface of a long oak worktable set against the glass. My hands were trembling again, but this time, the tremor was not born of fear. Neatly arranged across the table were dozens of glass jars, pristine wooden pallets, and heavy tubes of professional paint. I picked up one of the tubes, reading the elegant minimalist label. My heart performed a slow, heavy stagger against my ribs. These were not cheap acrylics. They were not the light, translucent watercolors my twin occasionally played with when she was bored and wanted to appear cultured. They were professional, artisanal oil pigments. Raw umber, burnt sienna, deep ultramarine, and a highly specific, rare brand of titanium white that I had only ever read about in imported art magazines, but could never possibly afford. The tubes felt incredibly heavy in my palm, a tangible validation of a dream I had long ago buried. I unscrewed the cap of the raw umber, and the rich, earthy scent of linseed oil and crushed pigment instantly filled the space, mingling perfectly with the cedar wood. It was the scent of belonging. Julian had always hated my painting. He called it a messy, useless distraction, entirely irrelevant to his desperate bids to save his failing corporate empire. Elena had never understood it either. She preferred the vibrant, loud energy of crowded ballrooms and expensive boutiques. No one in my family paid attention to the calluses on my fingers or the permanent charcoal stains beneath my nails. I had spent my life believing my passion was a shameful secret, a quiet rebellion that rendered me invisible. But the man who had supposedly purchased a bride to secure his public image had built this room. Arthur, a ruthless billionaire, who dismantled entire companies without blinking, had taken the time to source the exact, heavy oil paints that I secretly coveted. He had not prepared this space for a vibrant, restless socialite. He had meticulously built a sanctuary for a quiet, guarded artist. I set the tube of paint down, my vision blurring with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. I pulled open the top drawer of the wooden table, expecting to find spare brushes or palette knives tucked safely inside. Instead, my hand brushed against something entirely different. It was a small, worn leather book. I recognized the scuffed edges immediately. It was Elena's old journal, the one she had carried everywhere for the last 6 months, the one she had frantically scribbled in during those tense, suffocating weeks leading up to the disastrous wedding. What was it doing here, left behind in a house she'd supposedly fled from in sheer terror? I carefully pulled the book from the drawer. As I lifted it, a single piece of heavy cardstock slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the wooden floor. I bent down to retrieve it, turning it over in the pale morning light. It was a crisp, pristine white business card, embossed with a single name and a phone number. Arthur Pendleton. It was not his corporate office line. It was a private contact. Why did my sister, who was supposedly terrified of the cold tycoon she was being forced to marry, have his direct number tucked safely inside her most private journal? And more importantly, how had the journal ended up in a locked drawer inside my custom-built studio? Another 2 weeks slipped by in a haze of uncertainty, marking exactly a month since the wedding night. The cedarwood studio had become my absolute, solitary refuge, but the unanswered questions surrounding the journal had begun to press relentlessly against my chest. The narrative I had rigidly constructed, that Elena had run in blind terror, leaving me to face a monster, was slowly fracturing under the weight of this quiet reality. One afternoon, needing a sharp charcoal pencil and desperately seeking a weak excuse to bridge the terrifying gap between us, I left the warm sanctuary of my studio. The transition from my lavender-scented haven back into the main house was physically jarring. The temperature dropped immediately, the soft rugs giving way to the unforgiving echo of bleak stone halls. The Pendleton estate was vast and entirely still, like a dormant fortress waiting for a silent command. I navigated the long, sterile corridors, my bare feet silent against the stone, searching for the one room I knew my new husband occupied. His study was located on the ground floor, tucked away in the shadowy western wing. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar, much like the door to my studio had been. I hesitated on the threshold, the old, ingrained instinct to shrink, to hide, warring fiercely with the desperate need to understand exactly what kind of transaction I had walked into. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The study smelled intensely of old paper, dark ink, and winter stone. A massive fireplace stood cold and unlit against the far wall, flanked by towering, densely packed bookshelves. In the center of the room was a wide, imposing desk, completely clear of clutter save for a single, dark leather bank ledger resting open beneath the soft glow of a brass reading lamp. I had only come to find him, but the open book drew me forward like a magnetic force. The Paris ledger, binding all our fates together. Julian was a man of ledgers, of hidden debts and red ink that defined our family's impending ruin. Julian's books were always a chaotic, desperate mess of scribbled marginalia, a physical manifestation of his panic. I had spent years secretly reviewing his disastrous accounts, learning how to read the silent language of financial collapse. But this ledger was entirely different. The columns were perfectly aligned, the handwriting steady and deliberate. It was the ledger of a man who possessed absolute control over his world. I walked up to the edge of the desk, my eyes scanning the crisp, black ink on the open page. It was a record of recent personal transfers, logged with meticulous, clinical precision. My breath stopped entirely. There, dated exactly 3 days before the wedding, was a massive, cleared wire transfer. The destination was not a corporate holding company or a rival firm. It was an international routing number. Recipient: the Paris Art Academy. Beneficiary: Elena Sterling. Directly below it was a second transfer, equally large, sent to a private housing trust located in the French capital. I gripped the edge of the heavy desk, the polished wood biting sharply into my palms. My mind raced furiously, trying to force the fractured pieces of the puzzle together. My twin hadn't just climbed out of a window with a hastily packed suitcase and a desperate prayer. She hadn't blindly fled from a ruthless corporate predator into the dangerous unknown. The predator had proactively opened the cage. Arthur had funded her escape. He had paid off her steep international tuition. He had safely secured her housing. He had meticulously arranged for her to vanish across the world, entirely free from our father's crushing debts and Victor Vance's predatory threats. The billionaire who supposedly bought a bride to secure his ruthless empire had actively paid his own fiancée to run away. She came to me a week before the ceremony. The voice was low, smooth and heavy with a quiet gravity that immediately anchored the spinning room. I spun around, my heart leaping violently into my throat. Arthur stood in the doorway. He had abandoned his formal suit jacket, wearing only a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the lean corded muscle beneath. He did not look angry that I was standing over his most private financial records. He simply looked tired, leaning casually against the heavy wooden doorframe with his hands resting in his pockets. I stared at him, my voice barely a strained whisper. "You knew she was going to leave. You helped her." "I arranged the flight," he corrected softly, pushing himself off the frame and walking slowly into the room. He did not approach me directly. He moved toward the tall windows, looking out at the gray, rain-swept coastline that stretched beyond the estate. "Your sister is a vibrant, restless spirit, Clara." She walked into my office, shaking with absolute terror, and told me she would genuinely rather die than be locked inside this massive estate for the rest of her life. He paused, his broad shoulders rising and falling in a slow, steady breath. "I do not build cages, and I certainly do not purchase hostages to serve as my wife." "But the debt," I stammered, my fingers trembling uncontrollably against the dark leather of the transfer log. "Julian's debt, the strict contract. The contract was a necessary fiction," he said, turning his head slightly to look at me over his shoulder. His dark eyes were piercing, effortlessly stripping away every layer of defensive armor I had spent my entire life building. Your father required a grand spectacle to appease Victor Vance and the other circling creditors. He needed the world to firmly believe the Sterling family was unconditionally backed by Pendleton money. I allowed the arrangement to proceed on paper to keep those corporate vultures away from your door. But why? I asked, the overwhelming confusion spiraling into a deep, heavy ache in the center of my chest. If you let her go, why did you go through with the ceremony? Why did you let him shove me down that aisle? Arthur turned fully away from the window. He walked toward the desk, his footsteps completely silent against the thick rug. He stopped just a few feet away from me, the comforting aroma of cedar washing over the sterile smell of the old paper in the room. Because I read her journal, he said quietly. I flinched, remembering the worn little book currently sitting in the drawer of my private studio. Elena left it for me. She explicitly told me to read the pages she had marked before she boarded her flight. Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a softer, much rougher cadence. I read about a quiet, highly resilient woman who spent her entire life absorbing the brutal blows meant for everyone else. I read about an exceptionally talented artist who painted in the dark, who hid her bruised hands, who was entirely invisible to a family that only valued loud, empty charm and social utility. He reached out, his large, warm hand hovering just above the polished desk. He didn't touch me. He simply laid his fingertips gently on the edge of the leather cover. Your father thought he was merely swapping one pawn for another, Arthur murmured, his gaze locking onto mine with a steady, raw intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. He didn't realize the board had already been dismantled. I did not want to marry Elena, Clara, nor would I ever subject someone so terrified to a life she equated with a prison. But I could not ignore the sister she described in those pages, the one who quietly held the sky up for a family that never once looked up to thank her. I couldn't breathe. The absolute, unwavering respect in his voice burned right through my chest, rapidly melting the thick, icy walls of imposter guilt I had carried since I first was put in that flawless ivory gown. I wasn't a convenient placeholder. I wasn't a frustrating mistake he had simply decided to tolerate for the sake of public relations. I was seen. Is this how you settle the accounts? I breathed, the words trembling violently on my lips. I was referencing a cruel ultimatum my father used whenever he demanded my blind obedience, a tactic meant to instill guilt. But here, in this quiet room, standing in front of this formidable man, the dynamic lost all of its toxic venom. It became something entirely different. You buy my family's safety by taking on a duty to a woman you don't even know. Arthur's expression softened, a rare, microscopic shift in his usually impenetrable stoic armor. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. He withdrew his hand, slipping it back into his pocket, giving me the physical space I desperately needed to process the revelation. It is not a burdensome duty, Clara. For the first time in a very long time, this cold house feels like it actually has a pulse. But you are free to leave whenever you wish. The ledger proves the debt is handled. The studio upstairs is yours. The choice is entirely yours. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps steady and unhurried, leaving me alone in the dim light of the study. I looked down at the dark leather ledger, tracing the massive numbers that represented my sister's ultimate freedom. And then I looked up at the empty doorway he had just passed through. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. And standing there, listening to the coastal rain beat against the cold glass, I realized I had finally found a place where I did not have to make myself small. The revelation in the study did not immediately mend the fractured pieces of my reality. Healing, I was learning, was not a sudden burst of sunlight. It was a slow, agonizing thaw. For the first time in my life, the crushing weight of my family's inherited debt had been lifted. Yet my mind still constantly braced for an impact that refused to come. I was no longer a prisoner of a cold corporate transaction. But the freedom Arthur had quietly handed to me felt vast, unfamiliar, and deeply terrifying. That French account book sat in my mind, like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples of its truth disrupting. Everything I thought I knew about my husband. He had not been abandoned at the altar. He had orchestrated the opening of the cage. Back in my room, the ivory bridal gown still hung in the far corner of the massive cedar closet, a haunting reminder of the life I was supposed to be trapped in. It pooled around its hanger like spilled milk, white, flawless, and entirely meaningless. I had stepped into it expecting to be commodified, sold to the highest bidder to cover Julian's failures. Instead, I had been given a sanctuary. The sheer magnitude of Arthur's silent grace left me entirely unmoored. I spent hours sitting on the edge of the large, unfamiliar bed, staring at the rain lashing against the window panes, trying to reconcile the ruthless billionaire. The world feared, with the man who had left a warm cup of chamomile tea outside my door. The next day, I retreated to the private art studio he had prepared for me. The space smelled of fresh lavender and linseed oil, a stark contrast to the sterile marble corridors of the main estate. I stood before the sturdy cedarwood easel, tracing the grain of the wood with my fingertips. Arthur had built this space without demanding anything in return. I thought about Elena's journal, tucked away in the drawer beneath the paints, her frantic, desperate scribbles about escaping the crushing weight of Julian's expectations had moved a man the financial world deemed heartless to an act of immense, silent charity. He had seen my sister's panic and opened a door, and then he had looked at me, the forgotten twin, and built a fortress. A month after I discovered the truth about my sister's escape, I found myself wandering the expansive, manicured grounds of the estate. I needed to feel the biting coastal wind against my face, needing a physical sensation to ground the chaotic spiral of my thoughts. The jagged cliffs of the coastline dropped off into the churning, slate-gray ocean below. The air here was entirely different from the oppressive atmosphere of my childhood home. It was wild, unforgiving, and deeply cleansing. I pulled my thick woolen shawl tighter around my shoulders, my boots crunching softly against the wet gravel as I walked down the long, winding driveway toward the massive wrought iron gates that separated the property from the outside world. Not because I was looking to flee, but because I needed to stand at the boundary and consciously choose to stay. I never reached the iron bars. The sleek, predatory lines of a black luxury sedan cut through the dense coastal fog, tires hissing aggressively against the damp asphalt of the outer road. The vehicle jerked to a sudden halt, just inches from the closed gates. The heavy driver's door swung open, and the familiar, nauseating scent of sharp, expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke immediately pierced the clean ocean air. Victor Vance stepped out into the mist, my lungs seized. The instinct to shrink, to make myself entirely invisible, hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian's most ruthless creditor did not look like a street-level thug. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and a gold watch that cost more than my father's entire remaining estate. He was a corporate scavenger, a man who viewed human lives solely as leverage, fractions, and liquid assets. Victor walked right up to the iron bars, gripping the cold metal with both hands, his dark eyes locked onto me, his lips curling into a slow, terrifyingly confident smile. He spoke my name with a slow, toxic drawl, mocking my sudden elevation to the billionaire's wife, feigning surprise that I hadn't been thrown out into the street the moment Arthur discovered the substitution. I forced myself to stand my ground, though my hands were trembling so violently, I had to bury them deep inside the pockets of my coat. I told him the primary debt was settled and the contract signed, demanding he leave the property immediately. Victor's laugh was a harsh, scraping sound that held absolutely no humor. He didn't bother with pleasantries, immediately launching into the brutal reality of Julian's financial ruin. My father had been a remarkably sloppy gambler. Victor detailed the shadow accounts, secondary loans taken out in back rooms, completely off the books. Julian had borrowed heavily against the assumption that Arthur Pendleton's charity would cover all his past sins. Now, Victor demanded the remaining $2 million by Friday, threatening to leak the substitution of the bride to the board. He promised that Arthur's stock would take a massive hit when the financial press learned. He was played for a fool by a desperate, bankrupt coward and his worthless, leftover daughter. The ground seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The nightmare was not over. My father had dug a hole so deep that not even my sacrifice could fill it. Victor was not just threatening Julian anymore. He was threatening to drag Arthur's pristine reputation into the mud. weaponizing the very secret my husband had so gracefully kept. Panic rose rapidly in my throat. I stepped forward, driven by a sudden, desperate need to protect the man who had built me a sanctuary, promising Victor I would find a way to pay the money, if he just gave me time. He didn't want time. He wanted blood. The voice that cut through the fog behind me was low, absolute, and carried the devastating weight of a collapsing mountain. Arthur stated simply that the Sterling accounts were permanently closed. I spun around. Arthur stepped out of the mist, his long, dark wool overcoat sweeping against the wet gravel. He did not run. He did not shout. He moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who commanded every inch of the earth he walked upon. He stepped past me, his broad shoulders easily eclipsing my trembling frame, placing himself entirely between me and the wrought iron gates. The sheer physical presence of him acted as an immediate, impenetrable shield. The biting wind seemed to break around him, leaving me standing in a sudden, quiet pocket of safety. Victor's arrogant smile faltered, his hands instinctively dropping away from the metal bars as he stumbled over a weak greeting, attempting to justify his presence by citing outstanding family obligations. Arthur did not acknowledge the thinly veiled insult. He did not engage in a theatrical yelling match or lower himself to Victor's aggressive posturing. Instead, he reached calmly into the inner breast pocket of his coat. He withdrew a thick, neatly folded document, a formal debt settlement contract, and slipped smoothly through the narrow gap in the iron gates. In a tone completely devoid of heat, Arthur informed the creditor that the document covered the entirety of Julian's off-the-books ledgers, including the predatory interest illegally attached to them. The funds had already been wired to the holding company. Vance stared at the paper, momentarily speechless, the color draining rapidly from his face as he stammered about the staggering amount, completely bewildered as to why Arthur would pay for a bride who wasn't even the woman he was supposed to marry. Arthur simply withdrew a heavy, silver fountain pen from his pocket. The metallic click of the cap being removed sounded like a hammer striking an anvil in the quiet, damp air. He held the pen out through the bars. He issued a single, quiet command: sign the acknowledgement and leave. The unspoken threat hanging in the mist was absolute. If Victor ever approached the estate again, or if he spoke a single word of the Sterling family's private affairs, Arthur would dismantle his entire firm into useless splinters. The corporate scavenger swallowed hard, all his predatory bravado evaporating into the cold mist. With a trembling hand, Vance took the silver fountain pen. The sharp, erratic scratch of the nib against the thick paper was the only sound for several agonizing seconds. Victor shoved the signed document back through the bars, dropped the pen, and practically ran back to his waiting sedan. The tires spun on the wet asphalt before the vehicle disappeared entirely into the fog. Arthur slowly folded the signed contract and placed it back into his coat. He turned to face me, his dark eyes sweeping over my pale face and shivering shoulders. "I heard you cry. I didn't like it," he murmured, his voice dropping to a rough, quiet cadence that made my chest ache. The sheer magnitude of his financial sacrifice rendered me entirely unmoored. I whispered that it wasn't his burden to carry. That paying off Victor wasn't part of our original agreement. He took a single step closer, the comforting fragrance of cedarwood masking the lingering trace of Victor's cheap cigar smoke. "I do not care about the agreement, Clara. I care about your peace." He reached out, his warm hand hovering just an inch above my shoulder, before he gently guided me away from the gates, leading me back toward the warmth of the house. By nightfall, the coastal mist had hardened into a violent, unrelenting winter storm. The Pacific Northwest sky bruised into a deep, aggressive purple before turning completely black. The wind howled against the stone walls of the Pendleton estate, rattling the massive glass panes with a ferocity that made the ancient house groan. Shortly after 8 o'clock, the main power grid for the isolated coastal town failed entirely. The sterile, artificial lights of the massive mansion flickered twice before dying completely, plunging the estate into a profound, heavy darkness. The temperature inside plummeted with terrifying speed. I sat in the library, the largest and most imposing room in the house, feeling swallowed by the ink-black shadows. The leather of the sofa felt like blocks of ice against my legs. I wrapped my arms around myself, listening to the relentless drumming of the sleet against the antique glass, wondering if this cold was simply a return to the reality I had always known. Isolation was, after all, my oldest companion. Then, the heavy mahogany door opened and a soft golden light spilled into the room. Arthur entered, carrying a heavy brass lantern in one hand and a large bundle of split oak firewood under his other arm. He did not say a word as he crossed the room. He set the lantern on the heavy wooden desk and immediately knelt on the cold stone hearth of the massive, unlit fireplace. I watched him in silence, completely mesmerized by the quiet, practical efficiency of his movements. He arranged the kindling with meticulous care, building a small pyramid of dry wood before striking a long wooden match. The initial curl of gray smoke drifted up into the dark chimney, followed quickly by the sharp, bright flare of orange light. The sudden illumination cast long, dancing shadows across the towering bookshelves and highlighted the sharp, stoic lines of my husband's jaw. He stayed on his knees for a long time, feeding thicker logs into the growing blaze until the flames roared, pushing a wave of intense, glorious heat out into the freezing room. The scent of wood smoke mingled perfectly with the lingering aroma of old paper, leather bindings, and his signature cedarwood. Arthur stood, brushing a faint smear of ash from his dark trousers. He walked out of the room for a brief moment and returned holding the familiar copper tea kettle from the kitchen, steam rising softly from its spout, along with 2 porcelain cups. He poured the tea in silence, the gentle aroma of chamomile and faint peppermint filling the space. A quiet echo of the nightly ritual he had established outside my bedroom door. He held a cup out to me. The heat radiated through the delicate porcelain, charting a path straight down to my freezing core as my icy fingers wrapped eagerly around the smooth surface. Arthur did not return to his desk. Instead, he sat down on the opposite end of the long leather sofa, turning his body slightly so he could watch the fire. The storm outside raged, hurling sleet against the tall windows, but inside this specific room, the world felt entirely safe. "Julian always hated the dark," I whispered, staring down at the amber liquid in my cup. I had no idea why I was speaking, only that the silence felt too intimate, too heavy to bear alone. Whenever the power went out at the old house, he would panic. He couldn't stand being trapped with his own thoughts. He would make me sit in the hallway with a flashlight and read his accounting books aloud, just to drown out the silence. Arthur turned his head, his dark eyes catching the reflection of the flames. He watched me with that same unwavering, heavy attention that had terrified me on our wedding night, but now it only made me feel profoundly seen. I confessed everything in the quiet of that room. I told him how I had always been a convenience, a buffer against my father's ruin. Elena was the prize, the ticket out of bankruptcy. I was just the shadow who swept up the broken glass after Julian's tantrums. I admitted that stepping into that pristine silk dress had felt like stepping into a grave, fully expecting Arthur to demand a cruel return on his investment. I thought I was simply transferring my servitude from a desperate father to a ruthless creditor. I braced myself for his response. I expected him to offer pity, or perhaps detail the transactional logic behind his own actions, explaining the corporate maneuvers that led to our arrangement. I expected words, but Arthur did not offer a grand declaration. He did not explain his motives or lay bare the secret clauses of his own heart. The man who had bought my family's debts only to set me free simply reached across the space between us and gently pried the cooling porcelain teacup from my relaxing, trembling fingers. He set the cup silently on the low wooden table. Then, he reached toward the hearth and picked up a thick, rough towel he had placed near the stones to warm. Moving with agonizing care, he draped the heated fabric meticulously over my freezing hands. He folded it around my fingers, his large hands lingering over mine with a protective, reverent weight. "You are not a shadow here," he murmured. It was not a confession of sudden, overwhelming passion. It was not a demand. It was just a quiet, immovable fact. Not a transaction, not a debt, just a profound, unshakable presence. The protective walls I had spent 24 years building brick by brick began to dissolve entirely under the gentle, persistent warmth of his respect. The adrenaline of the day's confrontation with Victor, combined with the heavy, narcotic warmth of the roaring fire, began to pull at my consciousness. My eyelids grew incredibly heavy. I rested my head against the back of the sofa, the howling wind outside fading into a distant, muted hum. I didn't want to sleep. I wanted to stay awake in this quiet sanctuary forever, absorbing the steady rhythm of his breathing from the other end of the sofa. The storm raged violently against the coastal glass, completely shut out by the heavy stone walls. Surrounded by the scent of cedarwood, wood smoke, and the unwavering presence of my husband, I finally let go of my armor. For the first time in my life, I drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. Morning arrived in the library not with a sudden, triumphant burst of sunlight, but with a slow, pale gray creeping through the tall, rain-streaked glass. I woke up gradually, my cheek resting against the soft, worn leather of the sofa. The violent coastal storm that had rattled the massive stone walls of the Pendleton estate all night had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. The massive hearth, which had roared with glorious heat hours before, was now reduced to a quiet bed of softly glowing orange embers. I sat up slowly, the heavy wool blanket slipping down my shoulders. Arthur was gone. He had not lingered to demand gratitude for the warmth, nor had he stayed to dissect the raw, desperate confessions I had spilled into the dark. He had simply covered me when I fell asleep, tended the fire until the worst of the cold had passed, and quietly stepped back into the shadows to let me rest. I pulled the thick fabric tightly around my chest, inhaling the deep, lingering scent of wood smoke and cedarwood that clung to the fibers. For the first time in 24 years, the crushing, suffocating terror of my father's impending ruin was entirely gone. Julian's disastrous debts were paid. Victor Vance was banished. The transactional nightmare that had forced me down the aisle was officially over. I was safe, and yet, as I sat alone in the vast echoing library, a new, entirely different kind of ache began to bloom in the center of my chest. I stood up, my bare feet touching the cold stone floor, and began the long walk back to the east corridor. The Pendleton estate was a fortress, a magnificent, sterile monument to corporate power and old money. Arthur had miraculously transformed my small corner of it into a warm, lavender-scented sanctuary, but as I walked through the endless marble hallways, the sheer scale of the house pressed down on me. I opened the door to my bedroom and immediately saw that suffocating silk garment hanging in the far corner of the massive cedar closet. It remained exactly where I had left it, a pristine, flawless ghost. It was a garment designed for a confident, radiant woman who was supposed to effortlessly charm a billionaire into submission. It was never meant for me. I walked past the dress and continued down the hall, pushing open the door to the private art studio. The morning light caught the dust motes, dancing around the heavy cedarwood easel. I ran my fingertips over the polished oak work table, my gaze falling to the top drawer where I had discovered Elena's journal. That small, scuffed leather book was the true architect of my sanctuary. Arthur had read my sister's frantic, desperate words. He had seen the portrait she painted of a quiet, forgotten twin who absorbed every brutal blow their father delivered. He had built this room, sourced the expensive oil paints, and paid millions of dollars to sever my family's debts, because he possessed a profound, noble sense of honor. He had looked at a terrified substitute bride and decided to rescue her. But a sanctuary built out of pity is still a room I did not earn. I had spent my entire life standing in the empty spaces my sister left behind. I had swept up the broken glass after Julian's tantrums. I had worn Elena's discarded clothes and quietly accepted my role as the family's invisible buffer. Arthur had given me the ultimate gift, the absolute freedom to exist without fear, but as long as I remained locked inside this massive estate, surrounded by luxury I had not worked for, I would never know if I was truly a partner, or simply a rescued stray occupying a space built for a ghost. I needed to know if I could stand on my own 2 feet. I needed to know what it felt like to simply be Clara, entirely unmoored from the Sterling family drama and the Pendleton empire. The decision did not arrive with a dramatic, tearful breakdown. It settled over me with a quiet, undeniable clarity. I did not pack the cashmere sweaters Arthur's staff had arranged in my drawers. I did not take the delicate silk scarves or the expensive jewelry meant for the billionaire's wife. I opened my small, battered canvas duffel bag and packed only what belonged to me. A few worn linen skirts, 2 faded wool sweaters, and the sturdy, comfortable boots I had brought from my father's house. I walked over to the oak table and bypassed the rare, heavy tubes of imported titanium white and burnt sienna oil paints. Instead, I reached into the back of the drawer and gathered my old broken pieces of raw charcoal and my frayed, familiar sketching pencils. Finally, I picked up Elena's journal. The leather felt heavy in my palm. It had saved my life, but it was time to close the cover. I walked out of the eastern wing for the last time, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. I navigated the long, shadowy halls until I reached Arthur's study in the western wing. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, stepping into the room that smelled intensely of oak and winter stone. The massive desk was perfectly organized, the dark leather pad completely clear. I placed Lena's journal exactly in the center of the desk. Beside it, I laid down a single piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. I had spent an hour writing the note, my hand trembling, as the ink transferred my deepest, most fiercely guarded truth onto the paper. I did not write a dramatic farewell. I simply told him the truth. I thanked him for severing the chains of my father's debt and for proving to me that the world was not entirely composed of cruel, transactional men. I told him that he had given me the keys to an open door, but that a bird cannot learn to fly if it simply trades a harsh cage for a gilded one. I explained that I was leaving, not because I was afraid of him, and not because I was ungrateful, but because I refused to be a substitute ever again. I needed to build a life that I authored myself. I set the silver fountain pen down beside the note. I didn't look back as I walked out of the study. The heavy iron gates of the Pendleton estate stood tall and imposing in the thick morning fog, but they were unlocked. I pulled my duffel bag higher onto my shoulder and walked right through them. The crunch of my boots against the wet gravel was the only sound for miles. I did not call a luxury car service. I walked 2 miles down the winding, damp asphalt road until I reached the small coastal highway, where I boarded a weathered public transit bus heading south. I sat in the back row, pressing my forehead against the cold, vibrating glass. The massive stone fortress of the estate faded into the gray mist behind me. The tears finally came. They were not tears of sorrow or panic. They were the quiet, overwhelming tears of absolute release. A month passed. The world did not end. Julian did not find me, and Victor Vance remained nothing more than a bad memory. I settled in a small, sleepy coastal town nearly 200 miles away from the sprawling influence of the Pendleton Empire. It was a place defined by salt-sprayed wood, screeching seagulls, and a slow, methodical pace of life that demanded absolutely nothing of me. Using the meager, hidden savings I had hoarded away over the years, money Julian had never managed to steal for his wagers, I rented a tiny, drafty storefront on the very edge of the commercial pier. It was nothing more than a worn wooden floor, a chipped counter, and bowing shelves that smelled of sea salt, dust, and old paper. I named it the Coastal Spine, turning the front half into a second-hand bookshop, and the back room into a modest, functioning art space. It was completely devoid of polished gray marble or expensive crystal chandeliers. The coastal wind constantly rattled the thin glass of the front door, and the ancient radiator in the corner clanked and hissed throughout the afternoon. But it was mine. Every morning, I woke up in the small apartment directly above the shop. I swept the wooden floors myself, the repetitive, physical labor, grounding me in a way the sterile luxury of the estate never could. I bought an ordinary, dented copper tea kettle from a local thrift store, placing it on a small electric hot plate behind the counter. I spent my afternoons organizing donated paperbacks and sketching the rugged coastline with my raw charcoal, the calluses on my fingers slowly returning, rough and familiar. I was poor. I was entirely alone. But my dignity was absolutely intact. Yet as the days shortened and the coastal winter began to set in, a deep, persistent ache settled into the quiet spaces of my new life. I had reclaimed my independence, but I found myself constantly turning toward the door whenever the wind howled, half expecting to see a broad-shouldered silhouette step out of the storm. I missed the grounding, earthy scent of cedarwood. I missed the absolute, unwavering weight of his attention. I had proven to myself that I could survive without Arthur Pendleton, But in the quietest hours of night, listening to the ocean beat against the pier, I realized with devastating clarity that surviving was no longer enough. I wanted him, not his fortune, not his protection, but him. It happened on a Tuesday, just as the sky began to bruise into a deep, melancholic purple. The shop was empty. The small electric heater was humming softly by my feet, fighting a losing battle against the draft coming beneath the front door. I was standing behind the chipped wooden counter, carefully wiping charcoal dust from my hands with a damp rag. The tea kettle in the back room had just begun to emit a low, steady whistle. Then, the small brass bell above the front door jingled sharply. I didn't immediately look up. "I'll be right with you," I called out softly, tossing the rag beneath the counter. "Feel free to browse the new arrivals by the window." The customer did not move toward the bookshelves. The door clicked shut, cutting off the sharp wail of the coastal wind. A sudden, profound shift in the air pressure swept through the small, cramped room. It wasn't the smell of sea salt or old books that reached me. It was the distinct, immaculate scent of winter stone, wood smoke, and cedarwood. My breath caught violently in my throat. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the worn counter, so tightly my knuckles turned white. I slowly raised my head. Arthur Pendleton stood in the center of my drafty, second-hand bookshop. He was not wearing a pristine, tailored corporate suit. He wore a heavy, dark-knit sweater and a dark wool coat that looked entirely out of place among the dusty, leaning shelves. He looked tired. The sharp, stoic lines of his face were slightly drawn, and his dark air was damp from the coastal mist. But his eyes, those dark, piercing eyes that missed absolutely nothing, were locked entirely on me. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like a billionaire whose pride had been wounded by a runaway bride. He looked at the chipped counter, the worn floorboards, and the charcoal smudges on my apron with a profound, overwhelming reverence. The silence between us stretched, heavy and vibrating with all the unspoken words of the past month. I couldn't move. I expected him to demand an explanation. I expected him to tell me that my grand experiment in independence was over, that his security team had easily tracked my meager rental agreements, and that a limousine was waiting outside to take me back to the sterile safety of the estate. Arthur did not issue a command. He walked slowly toward the counter, his large frame making the small shop feel incredibly fragile. He stopped just inches away from the chipped wood. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy coat. He did not pull out a legal contract. He did not pull out the infamous ledger. He withdrew a single folded piece of thick official parchment. He laid it gently on the counter between us, and slowly slid it forward until it touched my fingertips. I looked down. It was the commercial property deed for the building. It was not leased. It was stamped as paid in full, and the sole, unquestionable owner listed on the official registry was Clara Sterling. "Arthur," I whispered, my voice trembling so badly the word barely materialized. I immediately pushed the paper back toward him, terrified of falling back into the very dynamic I had fled. "I can't. I left the estate because I refused to be another line item on your balance sheets. I didn't leave to negotiate a better settlement. I needed to build this myself." Arthur did not push the paper back. He didn't argue. Instead, he unbuttoned his heavy overcoat and looked around the cramped space. Without a word, the most feared corporate tycoon on the West Coast pulled a wobbly, mismatched wooden stool from the corner of the room. He carried it to the counter, placed it directly across from me, and sat down. The stool creaked ominously under his weight, but he simply rested his elbows on the chipped wood, completely surrendering his physical height and his imposing power. He looked up at me, the last remaining layers of his stoic, impenetrable armor completely gone. "I know," he said softly, his voice a rough, quiet rumble that instantly warmed the freezing room. "You left Elena's journal on my desk. You left the oil paints. You walked out into the rain with absolutely nothing to prove that your dignity was not for sale." He reached across the narrow space. He didn't grab my hand. He gently turned my palm upward, his thumb tracing the rough, calloused skin and the dark, stubborn stains of raw charcoal that marked my fingers. "I didn't buy this building to trap you, Clara," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my hands before rising back to meet my eyes. "I bought it so the landlord would never have the power to raise the rent and force you out." I bought it to ensure that your sanctuary remains permanently yours, whether I am standing in it or not. Tears blurred my vision, hot and uncontrollable. The absolute, staggering humility of the man sitting in front of me broke the final stubborn lock on my heart. He hadn't come to drag me back to his castle. He had driven 200 miles just to humbly ask if he could step inside mine. Then why are you here? I breathed, the tears finally spilling over my lashes, tracing hot paths down my cold cheeks. If you didn't come to take me back, why did you come? Arthur's hand shifted, his long fingers carefully interlacing with mine. The physical contact was an anchor, heavy and incredibly warm. A soft, devastatingly tender smile touched the corners of his mouth. A rare, quiet break in the winter stone. This is how you pay me back, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide. You let me stay. He wasn't asking for my obedience. He wasn't demanding a wife. He was a powerful, reclusive man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who only wanted his money, and he was sitting on a broken stool in a drafty shop, asking the woman who had walked away from his fortune if he could simply share her quiet life. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I held tightly onto his hand, the anchor holding me steady, seeing the rushing tide of my own heart. I turned my head slightly toward the back room. The kettle is boiling, I said quietly, a watery smile breaking through the tears. I only have chamomile. Arthur's shoulders dropped, a massive, silent exhalation of relief leaving his chest. His thumb brushed softly across my knuckles. Chamomile is exactly what I came for. People ask sometimes, what changed, when they hear the rumors of the ruthless Pendleton Empire scaling down. I don't know if I have a grand, corporate answer for them. All I know is this. The man who once offered me a sterile contract now sits on a worn stool in my shop every evening, reading a book while I sketch with raw charcoal. He did not buy my love. He simply proved, time and time again, that he was willing to wait in the silence until I was ready to speak. And that, I think, is the real vow. I don't need the marble estate. I don't need the flawless silk. I just need him here every day, sitting beside me, proving that forever isn't built in grand transactions. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.